Hello, everyone. My name is Jessica Flannery from Florida International University in Miami, Florida. I'd like to start by thanking the CPDD conference organizers for providing me this opportunity to share my work. And I'd like to thank all of you for listening today. I'm going to be presenting data regarding how teens' intentions to use electronic nicotine delivery systems, or ENDS, may be influenced by their peers. Speaking to the scale of the public health problem, worldwide, 1.1 billion people smoke cigarettes. And we can reasonably expect that about half of them will die of smoking-related diseases. Nationally, while teen cigarette smoking has been declining over the past 2 decades, ENDS use has skyrocketed. Current national estimates from the CDC indicate that about 5.4 million high schoolers endorsed using an ENDS product in the past 30 days. This is of particular concern because ENDS use potentially leads to nicotine addiction and increases the likelihood of transitioning to cigarette smoking. Thus, understanding the risk and protective factors that are linked with teens' ENDS use is important for mitigating the negative impact these new nicotine delivery systems might have. Accumulating evidence indicates that peer use is a primary risk factor for teens' future ENDS use. However, a more precise understanding of exactly how peers are exerting an influence on future use intentions remains to be characterized. As such, in this study, we aim to explore pathways through which peer use may influence use intentions. Such work might expedite the identification of intervention targets addressing adolescent ENDS use. Second, we aim to identify those adolescents that might be particularly susceptible to peer influences. Such work may provide insight into targeting prevention strategies towards those teens who would receive the most benefit. So we analyzed data from time point 1 of an ongoing 5-year longitudinal study investigating the antecedents and consequences of teens' ENDS use. Samples composed of 264 9th and 10th graders who were 14 to 17 years old, evenly split on biological sex, and predominantly Hispanic/Latinx, reflecting the demographics of the Miami-Dade County public school system. Within this sample, ENDS products were the most commonly reported substance that teens had ever tried, with 33% of the sample reporting ever trying. This is higher than the proportion of participants reporting trying either marijuana or a drink of alcohol. ENDS products were also the most commonly tried nicotine product by far, with only 8% reporting trying cigarettes or hookah. These rates of ENDS use are comparable to statewide estimates from the 2019 Florida Youth Tobacco Survey, where 39% of Florida high schoolers reported ever trying an ENDS product. Consistent with previous observations, we observed a relationship between perceived peer ENDS use and teens' use propensity. Specifically, those teens that reported ever trying ENDS also reported significantly more use among their peers. Additionally, higher peer use was significantly correlated with increased intentions to use ENDS within the next year. We then wanted to consider the reasonable hypothesis that peer ENDS use might influence an individual's intentions to use by also influencing teens' attitudes about ENDS. So to measure attitudes towards ENDS, we utilized the Electronic Cigarette Attitude Survey, or the ECAS. It's a 12-item self-report measure developed and validated specifically for use among teens. As would be expected, high schoolers that had ever tried an ENDS product had significantly higher positive attitudes about ENDS. Additionally, we observed that ENDS attitudes were also correlated with peer use, such that more peer use was linked with more positive attitudes about ENDS. Similarly, more positive attitudes were also positively correlated with greater use intentions within the next year. Next, we formally assess the interrelations between these 3 variables in a mediation model. When controlling for sex, we observed that attitudes towards ENDS was a partial but significant mediator, such that more peer use was associated with higher positive attitudes towards ENDS, which was in turn associated with increased intentions to use in the future. Given that the direct path remains significant, we next considered whether an additional variable could provide a more complete perspective for this indirect path. Specifically, we focused on teens' self-reported resistance to general peer influences. Although failing to reach significance, we observed that teens who had tried ENDS also reported less resistance to peers. We observed a significant negative correlation between resistance to peers and peer ENDS use, such that more peer use was linked with less resistance to peers. Similarly, more favorable attitudes towards ENDS was linked with less resistance to peers. Again, we formally assessed the interrelations between these variables in a mediation model, now incorporating resistance to peer influence in the indirect path. When controlling for sex, the indirect effect of peer use through these other two variables was significant, such that more peer use was associated with decreased resistance to peer influence. Less resistance to peer influence was associated with more positive attitudes towards ENDS, and in turn, more positive attitudes towards ENDS was associated with greater future use intentions. Yet again, the direct path remains significant, suggesting that there are additional variables that could be taken into account. These outcomes suggest that social influences can impact teens' ENDS use intentions by modulating ENDS attitudes. And interventions facilitating resistance to peer influence may be a viable prevention strategy, particularly among teens with ENDS using peers. However, certain at-risk high schoolers may be more likely to have peers that use ENDS than others. So to explore individual characteristics that were potentially related to peer influences, we considered externalizing and internalizing characteristics as measured with the youth self-report questionnaire. The externalizing scale includes measures of aggressiveness and rule breaking, while the internalizing scale includes measures of anxiety, depression, withdrawal, and somatic complaints. We observed that both externalizing and internalizing characteristics were significantly associated with increased intentions to use ENDS in the future. Interestingly, we found that peer ENDS use mediated the relationship between externalizing and future use intentions, such that higher externalizing was linked with more ENDS use among peers. However, peer ENDS use did not mediate the relationship between internalizing and future use intentions, as internalizing was not significantly associated with peer ENDS use. Again, we formally assessed the interrelations between these variables in a mediation model, this time incorporating externalizing as the initial predictor variable. When controlling for sex, both the direct and indirect effect were significant, indicating that the association between externalizing and future use intentions was partially mediated by peer ENDS use, resistance to peer influence, and ENDS attitudes. Higher externalizing was associated with more peer use, which was associated with decreased resistance to peer influence. Less resistance to peer influence was associated with more positive attitudes towards ENDS, which was in turn associated with greater future use intentions. In conclusion, our results support prior findings, linking more perceived ENDS use among peers and future ENDS use intentions. Additionally, we displayed that this relationship was partially explained by the impact of peer ENDS use on a teen's attitudes towards ENDS. Second, our results suggest that resistance to general peer influences may reduce the impact of peer use on ENDS and attitudes. Thus, we suggest that increasing resistance to peer influence might be a viable intervention strategy to reduce ENDS use. Finally, we observed that high schoolers higher on externalizing characteristics, but not internalizing, may be particularly susceptible to social risk factors that increase use intentions. Thus, we suggest that prevention efforts addressing these social risk factors may provide the biggest impact among teens that exhibit these externalizing characteristics. I'd like to acknowledge members of the ACE project research team and the Neuroinformatics Brain Connectivity Lab who contributed to this work. I'm happy to discuss any questions or comments you might have during my live Q&A session on Tuesday, June 23rd at 3:30 p.m. Thanks again to the CPDD for this opportunity to share my work and for you all for your attention.